iHeart and on Odyssey. America First with Sebastian Gorka, today at 3, right before Sean Thompson at 4 on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So CNN's Matthew Chance had the opportunity to catch up with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at an undisclosed location in Kyiv for obvious reasons. He asked Zelensky about the peace talks that happened at the Ukrainian-Belarus border the other day, and whether or not there's any real reason that we should hold out hope that the Russians are serious about a ceasefire.
Wasting time. And do you think you're wasting your time, or do you think they're ready?
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see with sort of a shoulder shrug, is what Zelensky said. Wasn't too encouraging, and that's, I'm sure, because he's being a realist about what he's getting from the Russians. In addition to that, Chance described Zelensky's position on sort of the next level of potential Western engagement, which would be a no-fly zone and the enforcement thereof.
I asked him whether it was time for countries like the US and other Western states to review that sort of position and perhaps to consider offering more than just military equipment and perhaps to offer manpower as well. He said, look, we want a no-fly zone, not in order to drag NATO into a war, but to provide security and to be a deterrent in the skies over the country.
Well, that's all well and good, and I appreciate Zelensky's perspective as somebody who's fighting for his country. However, those two things are mutually exclusive, the way I understand it. You can't say, I would like a no-fly zone, but not to draw NATO into war. Well, if you have a NATO-enforced no-fly zone, and it would need to be enforced for it to be effective, obviously, or even an individual country like the United States, then you're drawing them into war with Russia by definition. Colonel Doug McGregor offered this last night in advance of Biden's State of the Union speech on the prospect of a no-fly zone, that proposal.
Well, you'd end up at war with Russia because the Russians are not going to allow Western aircraft, U.S. aircraft, flying over the battlefield in eastern Ukraine under any circumstances. And Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, flew to Poland to stop the Poles from essentially offering MiG-29 aircraft that were improved and modernized to the Ukrainians, allowing their pilots to come to Poland, fly these into Ukraine. He put a stop to it, saying that anything like that could lead to war, and NATO will not go to war. And see, this is the interesting part. Now everyone is talking about spending lots of money on defense and lots of money for NATO, but very shortly people are going to begin to ask why. Why are we doing it? Because it's patently obvious that NATO is not in a position to fight, not in a position to challenge the Russians. So I think Mr. Biden's problem tonight is not just his narrative is going to break down very rapidly over the next few days as it becomes obvious that this whole Ukraine business was a fantasy on his part. He's going to end up trying to write checks that he can't cash because we can't afford a massive military buildup. We can't afford to put more forces forward. And if we try to do it, it'll be self-defeating. So I think we're in a real crisis now that no one has really figured out yet, and that is NATO itself and our position on the European continent. All of this is now at risk.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what he means all of this is at risk, NATO and our position in Europe, but let's see if we can get some additional insight on the topic and also comment on what the president had to say last night on the topic. Pleased to be joined again by former U.S. Ambassador to the UN and former Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, John Bolton. He's also the author of The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Glad to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
So what about this business of a no-fly zone that's being bandied about, and whether, even if it was enforceable, is it judicious?
Well, how many hours do I have to answer that question? I mean, having just heard the clip you played, there's so much misinformation, misunderstanding, really almost Russian propaganda in there. I don't know where to begin. Let's try and start from basics, because I think that's usually the best way to reason to a conclusion. Does the United States still believe that peace and stability in Europe are in America's interest? If we believe that, then we believe in a strong NATO. What does a strong NATO do? It does what the Romans said. It does what George Washington said in his first State of the Union message. It does what Ronald Reagan said. It's peace through strength. Or as the Romans said, si vis pacem, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have a strong NATO, but which is threatened not by aggression against one of its members, but by aggression against a country that the fall of which would affect its members, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, the Baltic republics, do you care whether that country is invaded or not? The answer is yes, we do, but not if it's too inconvenient. And so I think what's going to happen, absent something more, is a lot of brave talk and insufficient action.
Well, but so do you think a no-fly zone is something that NATO should agree to enforce?
Well, again, let me back up. You're asking me in move 22 of this chess game, what would I do? And it's a fair question. My answer is the last 15 moves have been bad.
Right.
We shouldn't be at this stage.
Right.
But I think there's yes, that's true. But it's worth reviewing the history of the mistakes that have been made so we don't make them again. Right now, I think a no-fly zone in the western part of Ukraine would make sense to try and stabilize the population there, to try to deter more refugee flows. Over 800,000 people now, could go as high as 5 million. I think that's just going to be incredibly disruptive in Eastern Europe. Is there risk? Yes, there is. If you're just content to have the Russians grind Ukraine into rubble, then fine, we shouldn't do anything.
Well, what about, can you tell us what you know about that 40-mile Russian convoy that's on its way to the capital?
Well, we know a little bit about it. The Pentagon believes they're running out of food, F-O-O-D, food, and gasoline. So if this is the powerful Russian army at its best, if we gave the Ukrainians those planes that the Poles wanted to give them, if we gave them more anti-tank weapons, if we had given them drones, we could turn, the Ukrainians could turn that convoy into a burning field. But that apparently is not going to happen.
With respect to the no-fly zone, were that to be enforced, you say that's not without risk, certainly. But do you think, I guess, the first question before even assessing the risks, the potential benefits, do you think a no-fly zone enforced in Western Europe could salvage the Zelensky regime in Ukraine? Does that provide them the breadth and space they need to actually repel the Russians and salvage Western Ukraine, or are we just buying time? I guess would be the question.
Well, I personally don't think the Russians really want all of Ukraine, because I think they know they'd be buying real guerrilla warfare if it got to that point. I think what they want is eastern and southern Ukraine for historical reasons and because Putin wants control of the North Shore of the Black Sea. And he's very close to getting that already. The issue here is whether people basically agree with the argument in the clip you just played, that if one Russian soldier fires one bullet at one American, and we respond by doing anything, we're basically going to nuclear war. It's not true. Of course, there's risk here, and the question is, do we think that the impact on Europe of the instability and the danger caused by this unprovoked aggression is worth an effective response? And it's not just a European question, because we know that China is watching very carefully. Mm-hmm. And if you're a citizen of Taiwan, you're very worried that Ukraine will fall and China will learn the wrong lesson.
But this threat assessment, so, I mean, the no-fly zone in Western Europe, that would, in your estimation, I'm not putting words in your mouth, I'm asking a question, it would present enough of a deterrent that Putin would sort of fall back to eastern Ukraine and not continue his effort to sack Kyiv and ostensibly install a puppet government, which is currently underway?
Well, I think he would like still to install a puppet government, and he might be able to do that. But this is a very patient man. You know, he first invaded Ukraine in 2014.
Right.
He annexed Crimea, and he took a substantial part of the Donbass, and then waited basically almost 8 more years until he took the next fight. I think he would be content to take less than all, but if he thinks he can get the whole thing and hold it at a sufficiently low cost, I think he's prepared to try and do it. And the issue...
sorry to interrupt, but another part of the threat assessment, too, is whether or not you believe, you know, the collective you, people in this space, believe that Putin, if he were to take Ukraine, would move on to NATO countries at some point, maybe perhaps not immediately, but that he would have his eye on the Baltics, Poland, Moldova, etc. Do you believe that, or do you believe that he stops at Ukraine and doesn't cross that NATO threshold?
Well, he's got 2 objectives. One is recreating Russian hegemony within the space of the former Soviet Union, and second, weakening NATO. If he can weaken NATO without crossing a NATO border, he'll do it. But remember, this is not just about kinetic warfare. We have always said that nobody has ever crossed a NATO border with military force, and that's correct. But in the 2010, 2011, 2012 period, the Baltics were attacked in cyberspace by the Russians. We were attacked in cyberspace in 2016 and subsequently. So the Russian view here is they're going to probe for NATO weaknesses. They're going to seek NATO divisions and try to exploit them. And I think they've had mixed results so far. But I think they also know, because Putin is a patient man, that European resolve is not strong, and that if this conflict ends with something that Russia wants, not all of Ukraine, but part of it, it won't be long, in their view, before the Europeans weaken, and the sanctions will fall, and we'll be back to where we were until the next time that Putin decides to move.
This may be a provocative question, but if Putin was assassinated, would that end? I mean, would the tanks go back to Russia? Would the fighting stop?
Well, you know, there's speculation about the possible coup d'etat efforts inside Russia. There's clearly dissent. The oligarchs don't like their yachts and villas being seized. And, you know, rich and famous Russian people don't like being inconvenienced. So there is discontent. You can't rule out the possibility, but this is a time to put more pressure on, not just confiscating the assets of rich Russians. I would impose a total visa ban on any Russian coming to the United States, and hopefully all of our friends in Europe would do the same. Make the Russian people really understand how unacceptable this unprovoked aggression is. And the more you do that, the more you create turmoil inside Russia. But as with Nikita Khrushchev after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Politburo decided to remove him. So I do think it's possible.
He is John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, former Assistant to the President for National Security, author of The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. John Bolton, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks again for having me.
Thank you, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
A while back, we at AmericanEagle.com were asked to build the e-commerce site of a major candy distributor. With the need for a website that could take into account everything from shipping times to local weather, because, you know, candy melts, the task was not like taking candy from a baby. Fortunately, we live for a good digital challenge and free bonbons. So we got to work on a slew of complex integrations, including a shipping algorithm that factored in variables like distance, speed, and location. The website even let the end customer personalize their candy for special events, like weddings or, you know, major website launches. When all was said